My name is Pike, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Paul Bloom and his TED Talk video entitled, "Is Prejudice Ever a Good Thing?" Paul Bloom is the faculty head of psychology and cognitive science at Yale University and is a prolific and highly respected member of the scientific community. Given that I've studied some of Bloom's work and have a genuine interest for psychology, I chose this video because there seemed a lot I can learn about the psychology of prejudice and bias from one of the world's top authorities on the subject, as well as recognize and emulate some of the presentation techniques he, as a world-renowned professor, has acquired. Paul Bloom wastes no time in getting to the theme of his talk, and his directness is one of the primary reasons he's capable of giving such an effective presentation. The first thing he says in this video is this: when we think of prejudice and bias, we tend to think of stupid and evil people doing stupid and evil things. This process of thinking is widely accepted and is nicely summarized by the British critic William Hazlitt, who wrote, "Prejudice is the child of ignorance." I want to try to convince you here that this is mistaken. I want to try to convince you that prejudice and bias are natural, they're often rational, and they're often even moral. And I think that once we understand this, we're in a better position to make sense of them when they go wrong, when they have horrible consequences, and we're in a better position to know what to do when this happens. The theme here is clearly delivered and is easy to understand, but it's very controversial. While Bloom definitely concedes that a lot of horror comes from prejudicial views, he encourages the audience that prejudice, being that it guides us through life and provides us with innate and basic knowledge about the world around us, shouldn't always be painted with the same brush as things like ethnocentrism, racism, anti-Semitism, and sexism. He quotes author William Hazlitt again to get his point across, who writes, "Without the aid of prejudice and custom, I should not be able to find my way across the room, nor how to conduct myself in any circumstances, nor what to feel in any relation of life." Elaborating further on this point, Bloom provides an example of how we use prejudice properly and justifiably in our everyday life, without even really realizing it. Bloom provides an example of how we use prejudice properly using visual aids showing us a chair, a dog, and an apple. Bloom asks us to analyze the way we perceive these objects. He says that our prejudice and biases lead us to believe that the chair will be sturdy if we sit on it, the apple will be edible, and the dog will bark if we aggravate it. He says these are versions of good biases that, give us innate knowledge of things that are just around us and are just normal objects. Of course, it's possible that the chair isn't really sturdy, the apple isn't poisonous, and the dog is unusually tame, but Bloom says that it's our prejudices and biases that give us knowledge and experience on the aspects of each of these things, and would conclude that these are rational, harmless biases. Applying stereotypes to objects one may object, one may well protest, is not the same as labeling actual people. Bloom recognizes the validity in this point as well, but urges that when we apply them to people, we're to be extra careful as to not make any irrational assumptions on how someone is based purely on their appearance. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't make any judgments or preconceived notions of them at all, though, because this is both undesirable and basically impossible. It's undesirable in that, Bloom notes, because understanding we have these biases helps us to see why some of these biases go awry. It's impossible because human psychology, even if subconsciously, is built to assume stereotypes, bias, and prejudice to varying degrees of extremity all the time. And if we recognize these biases, then it'll help us to make sense of them when they go awry. So a lot of people are immediately hostile to this idea. Prejudice, bias, and stereotyping in any occurrence are generally frowned upon in society and thought of as always irrational, always unjustified, and completely inseparable from things like ethnocentrism, homophobia, and sexism. Current controversial events that hold connection to this talk now are by no means rare. Parts of North American society, even after 150 years since the abolition of slavery in the United States, are still considerably racist. Events this year, such as the Michael Brown shooting that sparked riots and protests in Ferguson, Missouri, as well as the most recent death of Eric Garner, were events that many believe had involved prejudice that was taken too far, as each victim was black and presented very little threat. Uproars were created in light of these events, and social media exploded with campaigns like "I Can't Breathe" to try to combat prejudice and what they perceived to be as bias toward the police force. The mind and psychology of the average police officer, Bloom would suggest, may have a moderate amount of preconceived opinion on someone based on their skin color, even if subconsciously. This is an example of unjustified prejudice, but when Bloom suggests that there are certain types of justified prejudice or bias, many people are immediately hostile to that idea. Bloom believes that a lot of prejudice implanted in people to do with the culture forcing the individual to think that they are completely unprejudiced and completely unbiased, when realistically this is no possibility for even the most objectively thinking among us. He proposes that if we were to address this fact head-on, we would have less incidents like Eric Garner. Bloom, in performing this talk, is not presenting a set of uncontroversial ideas that are already largely accepted by society, as it becomes visible throughout the talk that the unsettling atmosphere among the crowd and the ideas they seem to reject immediately. The TED Talker Paul Bloom is the head of Department in Psychology and Cognitive Studies at Yale University, and so being a professor, he gives lectures on such topics on a regular basis and well-versed in the material and the different techniques to engage audiences. This qualification and expertise shows in his talk. While there are a wide array of tricks he uses to keep the audience engaged, there are 5 dominant methods in the talk that I noticed while watching it several times. Paul Bloom is very direct and straight to the point in his talk. Being direct, straightforward, and concisely explained is important for obvious reasons. The level of understanding your audience walks away with after the talk is hugely contingent on whether or not your ideas are delivered effectively but also efficiently. And I think Bloom achieves this. Bloom wastes no time in getting to his theme, and after he states that, he explains to the audience how his arguments will generally follow. Not a single sentence is wasted, no unnecessary or confusing elements are added, and this is also important to the conflict because rather than fluffing up or trying to over-explain his thesis, Bloom gets straight to the point. And right after he says, "I think this is mistaken, I want to prove to you that prejudice and bias are often rational and moral," a quick shot of the audience shows that some members are uneasy at this statement. There's definitely conflict and hostility in the idea of glorifying or even justifying prejudice and bias, which contributes to the theme because Paul Bloom is trying to show us how these two things can be good and help us recognize when they are bad. The different visual aids Bloom utilizes are also hugely helpful to the presentation. In demonstrating a few of his psychological experiments, Bloom uses images for the audience. The frequent change in scenery and not just Bloom talking all the time is also effective for the ADHD-esque viewer. He uses images and videos where explaining things only with words may have been confusing or harder to get the point across with. For instance, when Bloom makes a point about in-group versus out-group psychology, or as he describes it, tribal mentality, he compares it to the history in extreme cases of war, where their out-group isn't merely given less, but is completely dehumanized, as in the Nazi perspective of Jews as vermin or lice, or the American perspective of Japanese as rats. Amplifying the truthfulness of this point, he shows the World War II poster that displays a picture of Alaska and the caption of "Death Trap for the Jap." This image is powerful because it's instrumental in proving that prejudice was very real in history and even still is today. Bloom uses an example to introduce the definitions of prejudice and stereotype beliefs, but then proves why he thinks that these cases of dehumanizations are the result of otherwise irrational ability to use prejudice and bias, but they just went awry. Many people in presentations are monotonal, and it's never just a small infringement on their speech. Paul Bloom is aware of this and uses his pitch and tone to emphasize certain parts of what he is saying and its level of importance. He delivers emotion, interest, and style when he speaks, and I observe that he effectively captivates the audience doing these two things very well. Bloom does this thing where he pauses before an important word or concept. Doing that makes Bloom punch out what comes next to show the audience that this part of his speech is really important and that he doesn't want them to miss it. He also speeds up the rate of his talking to show excitement. Speeding invariably makes his tone of voice more urgent and compelling, and it does a better job of convincing his audience of what he's trying to say. These two mannerisms in Bloom's speech are instrumental in keeping the audience engaged. We know that Paul Bloom is qualified in his area of study and is qualified to speak to us about psychology. But there are other ways Bloom exhibits his authority on the subject, and this helps the audience invest trust in what he's presenting. Unlike many speakers, Bloom is at least unburdened by nervousness or its harmful effects on speech delivery. Calm, collected, and relaxed, Bloom is not only articulate and clear, but seems to backtrack and stutter not even once. He's clearly well-rehearsed and comfortable with the material, and this reinforces his image as a knowledgeable person who's not only confident in his work, but has the confidence of others in him and is a trusted speaker too. His expertise is covertly indicated by his confidence, and this helps the audience members to trust and stay interested in the talk. He talks to the audience directly, doesn't pause or stutter, motions with his hands, gestures to place emphasis on points, and amplifies interestingness and fascination in his work. These are only subtleties in the presenting, but they speak volumes to the audience about Bloom, his captivating subject matter, and his expertise. Authenticity is something we touched on briefly in class. When Seth Rogen appeals to the House of Congress proposing funding for Alzheimer's disease, he does so in a way that's signature Rogen. Refusing to break character in such a setting, Rogen stays true to his strengths and shows no reluctance to imply comic relief in such a setting. That speech shares a key element with other effective talks, which is that the orator keeps his or her authenticity. Although Bloom may not always be known for his comedic value as someone like Rogen, he throws a few jokes and integrates humor well into the talk, giving the audience a form of comic relief and presenting an idea in an entertaining way. Of course, authenticity isn't something limited to humor only, and there are many other ways in which Bloom conveys originality as a quirky expert who has fun doing his work and showing his ideas to others. The lasting message Bloom wants to convey to his audience is this. I think prejudice and bias illustrate a fundamental duality of human nature. We have gut feelings, instincts, emotions, and they affect our judgment and our actions for good and evil. But we are also capable of rational deliberation and intelligent planning. And we can use these to, in some cases, accelerate and nourish our emotions, and in other cases, staunch them. And it's in this way that reason helps us create a better world. Though this topic is highly controversial, Bloom does a great job of proving his points and changing the way people think of prejudice and psychology in this conclusion. Through his talk, he also does this effectively using proper oral communications like monitored pitch and tone, visual aids, and authentic approach to the presentation, as well as concise and clear directness and confidence. Thank you.